I'm Elesha Coffman. I'm a professor of history at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and I am here to use the Religion News Service collection. It is now Religion News Service. It was for the first 50 years, which is the period of the archives here, Religious News Service. It was founded by the National Conference of Christians and Jews in the early 1930s, and it was thinking that there was a lot of misinformation about Protestants, Catholics, and Jews in that period. They had very distorted ideas of each other. There was a lot of tension and animosity. Everett Clinchy, the head of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, and this guy named Louis Minsky, who was a freelance journalist from England. His family was Russian Jewish heritage. According to the founding story, Minsky goes into Clinchy's office in New York and says, "Hey, what about an Associated Press, but just for religion news?" And Clinchy says that really aligns with our goals to build interfaith brotherhood, so sure, let's do it. And for those first 50 years, Religious News Service operated under the auspices of National Conference of Christians and Jews. It had editorial independence. I don't think anybody from NCCJ was signing off on stories, but they were, for most of that time, located in the same building, and NCCJ was subsidizing RNS and writing all of the checks. A lot of the same ideals about interfaith tolerance and brotherhood and understanding, and the idea that the way that you get to that tolerance and understanding and really bolster a multi-faith, multiracial democracy was through the sharing of accurate information. So NCCJ sold it off in, I think, 1983. That's when the archives were boxed up and came here. And then the ongoing news operation has bounced around a lot of places since then. It's been part of another publishing company or allied with a school of journalism or independent and grant funded, which is more where they are now. The range of religions they cover has expanded. It was pretty narrowly Protestant, Catholic, Jew early on. They had an editorial philosophy, again, early on, not to cover what they called the lunatic fringe. So some smaller religious groups that might be called sectarian, or some of the more strident voices within those religious traditions. They just thought it was not good for the cause of tolerance and brotherhood to play up the extremists. It was better to focus on what they considered the more reasonable voices within those religious traditions. They're not using that kind of filter anymore. The news consumption habits have changed so much. I think that we are used to always hearing from the lunatic fringe in religion, in politics, in anything. That's really what gets all of the attention now. And RNS will cover more of that now, as well as other Muslim faith traditions, and a lot more on evangelical and Pentecostal traditions. Evangelicals are absent from some of the early records I've been looking at. They sort of get discovered by RNS in the 1950s, but other traditions that I know as a historian had a lot of people, like Pentecostalism. You wouldn't really know that they existed from most of the RNS files. That wasn't on their radar, and that wasn't what they wanted to focus on. Whereas today, if a Pentecostal megachurch makes news, then RNS might very well cover it. The dominant religious expression has changed so dramatically, and media coverage of it has changed so dramatically, that in some ways it feels like these files are talking about a different world, and then in other ways it sounds so similar. I was a journalist before I went to graduate school to study American religious history, so I've always been interested in the thinking and the resources and the constraints of the people on that side of the desk at a media organization. They can't cover everything. It doesn't occur to them to cover everything. They might not want to cover everything for any amount of reasons. With professional journalists, it rarely comes down to something as blunt as bias. It's more this combination of who are our subscribers and constituents, and what's our budget, and what's the time frame we're working on, and how many pages do we have, and what can we cover with photos versus what can we cover with text. All these different things going into then what becomes the media that's available for the consumers. I think in the 1960s, there was still the desire for RNS to make religious people look good. Some of that is coming out of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, their parent organization. A lot of it is coming out of the fact that in the period that I'm looking at, and in the 60s, it was a wire service. It supplied stories that its clients, which were mostly Protestant periodicals, Catholic diocesan newspapers, and major metropolitan dailies that had a big church page or church section. That was the subscribers. One of the big, really unfortunate stories of the 1960s was how often white Christians were fighting to keep segregation. RNS was not typically going to cover that. White Christians behaving badly was not a big part of their coverage. On the other hand, there were a lot of ways that religious Americans, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, were involved in supporting civil rights, coming alongside, being part of the freedom rides and being part of the marches, and also making a lot of decisions within their churches that would be seen as very progressive on race. I've found things in the archive that I didn't know about individual churches or groups of churches in various southern cities standing up to their governor, for example. The governor saying that he wanted to close the public schools rather than integrate them. And it was a group of churches saying, no, you absolutely can't do that. We want to defend our public schools. I always like it as a historian when something surprises me. And RNS really diligently wanted to cover the ways that church people and American Jews were supporting behind the scenes as well as out front civil rights action. Those kinds of things, church council discussions or bishops saying things, that wasn't necessarily going to be chronicled anywhere else, but it was going to be chronicled by RNS. It's always instructive to look back at when assumptions were different, when framing was different. You can see ways that there's still similarities and ways that things have changed. The focus on the sort of quiet, sometimes plodding work of religious institutions and individuals, that doesn't get as much attention now. We can forget that it's even going on. From my own perspective as a participant as much as a historian, for much of my life, there was not a lot of public protest action, and now there is. And I think it's tempting for those of us who are newcomers to this to think, well, obviously something's got to change quickly, like this is intolerable. And then to look back at the older records and see it was very, very, very slow, and it took a lot of decisions and actions and violence frequently for any change to happen. And throughout that, journalistic curiosity is something that is a real benefit to us in a democracy as well as a benefit to historians. Religion News had different slogans over the years, but one of them was to make the important interesting. The editors believed that religion was an important social force. It could seem kind of boring, and it was their job to tell the reading public, even if we small editorial staff don't always agree with everything that's going on, this is important and interesting and worth attending to. As I listen to an RNS podcast now or interact with some of the journalists there, there's still that curiosity and drive to try to get the story right, which I really appreciate in the past and in the present.